parlor in the original house, because that door there leads to the hallway off of the bathroom. So the men could come in here and have their cigars and go down to the wine cellar through that narrow door. But it now leads to the bathroom for this guest room. It used to lead to a wine cellar. But the half-teaster bed is from the 1860s and 70s. It's actually designed by Charles Eastlake, who was an architect from England that designed furniture that could be carved by machine. So it made furniture affordable. So this half-teaster bed with the horizontal grooves, the crossed bows, very typical of his designs, similar to this nightstand with the pulls on the drawers. And it'll take a while. So that's John Klein. This is George, her brother. This is her marriage to Isaac. She recorded in her Bible. But John Klein was born in Waterford, Virginia. His father, Lewis, built this hotel there, a house of entertainment, in 1817 or 1816 to 1825. John Klein was born in Waterford in 1812, and he moved to Vicksburg in about 1824 when he was 22 years old. Here's John Klein. This is John Klein's grandfather, Jacob's will. He was from Frederick, Maryland, and his grandmother, Mary. But he writes this in 1785, Mary, his grandmother. So Lewis and Elizabeth had 11 children. Here John Klein was born in 1812. This is his mother, Grandma Klein. So the Maryland German church records from Frederick, Maryland is where John Klein's grandparents were from. John and Elizabeth met in Natchez. He met her when she was 12 and he was 26. He married her when she was 16 and he was 30, and they had 10 children. God. He built Cedar Grove for her as a wedding present and took her to Europe for a honeymoon for a year, where they bought a lot of the things for Cedar Grove. Some of the transom glass, that red transom glass, and some of those palladium windows they bought in Europe. And then she came back here and started having babies. So she had 10 children. The first was George. His house was across the street. Susan was number 5 that this house was built for. And number 9 is Willie Sherman Klein. Well, he was born September 3rd, 1863, which means during the siege, Elizabeth was pregnant with her 9th child. This is Willie. Well, the Kleins were allowed to leave Vicksburg, go through the Union line north of town where Sherman was, because Elizabeth was originally from Ohio and her uncle was General Sherman. So she was related to Sherman. Sherman probably came over to their house for dinner if he didn't stay with them up at their plantation home. She's pregnant with her 9th baby. She gives birth to the child after Vicksburg surrenders, and they name the child William Tecumseh Sherman Klein, after General Sherman. Now, I'm not sure how popular that made him in Vicksburg after the surrender, but he was 16 years old when he was killed accidentally by his friend. They came back to Cedar Grove, and his friend was polishing their pistols, and Willie's pistol went off and killed him instantly. He said, fell into his little friend's lap and said, "You shot me," and he died. But his younger brother, Frank, had died the year before of yellow fever. So they lost 2 as children, 2 as babies, but 6 grew up to be adults, and they each got a house. These are all the deaths of the children. See, Frank Howard died of yellow fever. John and Elizabeth when they got a little older. But John Klein was actually, when he moved to Vicksburg, he started a jewelry store. He was a jeweler at first, and these are his jewelry, Klein jewelry, spoons, ladles, coffee cups, things like that he made. And he also had a cotton plantation, and he got, because he had the property cleared, he had a lumber business. He was a very well-divested guy. This is Cedar Grove before the street was built. There's deer in the picture. It was popular to have cast iron deer in your yard. So there's a cast iron deer in Cedar Grove. That's the cistern next door. There's Cedar Grove with that gazebo. There it is, about 1930. This is about 1900. This is Elizabeth, Susan's mother, sitting in front of that gazebo. That mound over there is the cistern. There's a tank inside there that holds the fresh waters for the house. And this is Elizabeth standing behind Cedar Grove and Susan's sister, Lizzie. That's the staircase behind Cedar Grove, which is still there, painted black. This is John Klein's will. He bequeaths everything to his dearly beloved wife, tells his children to be kind to their mother because the comforts of her lonely condition, he says, comfort her. She's going to be missing me. This is Elizabeth's will. She says, I make no provisions for my son George Klein and my daughter Clara Burchett, as I consider that each one has already received their portion of my estate during my lifetime. Well, George Klein was president of the bank that John Klein started, and it failed in 1882 because a teller was gambling in grain futures and lost the entire fortune of the bank, and the bank failed, and the stockholders were liable for all the money. So John Klein died in 2 months. I think the stress of that killed him. And George was found not guilty of the bank failure, but he already cost Elizabeth way too much money and her husband's life from the stress of it. So I don't think she forgave him. But the probate of Elizabeth's will, where Susan was the executrix, it was written in 1909. Women couldn't even vote until 1919, and she made her daughter the executor, which I found interesting. Talks about the rents of the storehouses on Washington known as the Reynolds Drug Company, the Sherrard Grocery, and the Marley Shoe Company. So she didn't lose her real estate with the bank failure. You know, they invented the shoebox in Vicksburg. They first sold a pair of shoes with a pair with a left and right foot in a box. And there were more businesses in downtown Vicksburg in 1886 and 1902 than there are today. Isaac was shot at the corner of Washington and Crawford Streets, probably right here, and he was taken to the Reynolds Drug Company a few doors down that Elizabeth owned to find a doctor to get the bullet out, but they weren't able to save him. He died here the next day. But if you look at all the businesses down there, there's a, shooting gallery and bowling alleys and banks and hardware stores, stationery.
Okay.
Anyway, this is George standing in front of his house across the street in 1908 from grandfather. But the foundation for this house was still over there when my parents bought this house. That's the cottage over there. Here's George.
Was the cottage built on the slab? On the foundation?
The cottage was built with the house. It was a servant's
Oh, that's
quarters.
right. That's right.
So that house, that
Was
little house was
behind
probably
the other house,
1869. Yeah, I'll show you on the map. This is the map of the bank that got blown away in the tornado of '53. So it's no longer downtown. The columns are
Pretty.
The columns are on two houses on National Street in Vicksburg. This is George's house. He fell into some disrepair after he died. And there's the railroad coming up to Kleinston where John Klein used to ferry trains. This is Elizabeth with Willie, holding Willie. And this is how Elizabeth was related to General Sherman. There's John Klein's headstone when it was next door. There's Elizabeth. And this is John Alexander Klein, Major General John Alexander Klein III. So he made it big in the U.S. Army. He served in the Army at the same time as my grandfather, so they probably knew one another because they were close in rank. My grandfather was a colonel. Anyway, this is the flood of 1927 versus 2011. You can see how high the water got in 2011. It almost came up over the wall. Supreme Court case for some insurance fraud the Kleins were involved in. And these are all obituaries I got from one of George Klein's son. Oswald was autistic, and he collected obituaries. So all of these obituaries came from one of the descendants of George Klein. But death of Mr. Klein, in memoriam, George's obituary. Oops. Death of a venerable lady, death of Mrs. E.B. Klein. This is Willie's obituary. The ball ground was their home. It's just north of here.
Yeah.
Madison was, this was John Klein's brother, and this was their son, Madison. Cave life in Vicksburg. And this is a funeral of the day. That's a hearse, and these are hacks, which carried the mourners. But Isaac's obituary goes on and on. He was, they say his popularity was phenomenal, and his great, big, generous, loving heart was a perpetual fountain bubbling over with kind, cordial thoughts and generous deeds for his fellow men. If he ever had an enemy in the world, his name has never been recorded.
Oh.
in the fatal shooting of Mr. Ike Bonham, a merchant of Vicksburg, who was shot by Harry Moore, who intended to slay John Coleman, a newspaper reporter. Moore is the same killer who some years since killed Mr. Hazlett, an old citizen of Vicksburg. This is Mr. Hazlett. I found his picture at the courthouse. He looks like an big old citizen, doesn't he?
Mm-hmm.
So this is her son John's obituary. He doesn't say how he died, just that he was 9 years, 6 months, and 22 days old. And he was, just a few weeks ago, he was peculiarly sad because he was healthy just a few weeks prior. Susan was 82. There's Isaac, pistol shot in the hands of Harry Moore. He got shot by his friend. John Klein's funeral, $212. This is just a postcard of Cedar Grove. Clara, she got written out of the will. This is Dr. Burchett, and that's her portrait. Look how tiny her waist is. And that's her wedding portrait. So Louis and Elizabeth had 11 children. John Klein and Elizabeth had 10. George and Louise had 11, and they lived across the street. Clara and Theophilus had 9, and they got written out of the will with all those kids.
And the Balfour, that's the same Balfour
George
that has Balfour House. Yes.
Yeah, Emma, her sister, Louise, Emma Balfour was the one who wrote the diaries. And this is our house taken from across the street from what was George's house, because this is George's house, and here's our house in 1925 with that 7-car garage back there. But George's house with our cottage, and all these are gone. These little buildings here are gone, but the brick walls are still there. So you can see somehow they were taken with steps and stuff going up to here to our house, probably taken from about here up. And there was a house where our parking lot is. It was a huge house there. And this is the bed, the Charles Lee bed, that looks a lot like our master bedroom bed. This was the black.
Yeah, it does.
The black furniture mirror. He studied under Millard in New Orleans. And just trivia, Mississippi. This is a plane they have over at the museum, the Air Museum across the river. Lots of trivia. I just put that in for guests because it talks about the teddy bear and all. Here's Teddy Roosevelt came to Vicksburg for a bear hunt in 1902, and they took him up to Onward, Mississippi, and they tied a bear to a tree for him to shoot. He refused to shoot it, and that's why they made the teddy bear, because he didn't want to shoot a bear tied to a tree.
Yes.
And this is the tornado in 1953, which ripped right through Vicksburg, 5:30 at night on December 5th. And it was a Category 4 tornado, and it killed 38 people. And it hit this house, and it knocked the chimneys off the south side. Oh, this is our house in a snowstorm in 1902. It snows here every now and then.
Yeah,
This
very
is about
rarely,
1930. But we do get snow every now and then. This is about 1930. This is Mrs. Ivy, her dog and cat, in this room. And here's the East Lake room when the daughters lived in there.
with their little hats laid out.
Here's Mrs. Ivy. This is the back porch before it got glassed in. But I think the Ivies named the house the Corners, and it was closed that day, I guess. But it was always painted white, so my parents painted it the colors that it is now. This is Sneed, the guy that painted from the hot air balloon. But he got captured in November of 1863, and he was put in a prison camp in Georgia. And because of his paintings of where he was in prison, they were able to find Camp Lawton, Georgia, and do archaeological digs. And this is the Sultana. The Sultana was a ship that was brought to Vicksburg at the end of the Civil War to take Union prisoners home. And they had been held in Confederate prison camps like Andersonville. And they brought them here. They were probably sick and starving. They overloaded the boat by putting 2,800 passengers on there. That was only a boat rated for 376 passengers. Headed north. He was having trouble with his boilers, but you can see one of them is smoking. Well, the boiler blew up 7 miles past Memphis, and more were killed on the Sultana than any other It's the greatest maritime disaster in U.S. history to this day. And you never hear about it because it happened at the end of the Civil War, and Lincoln had just been shot by John Wilkes Booth, and they were trying to find him. So Lincoln's body was on a train coming back from Washington to Illinois to be buried, and all of that press got all the attention, not the sinking of the Sultana. So there were a lot of men from Tennessee. So there's an actual monument in Tennessee near Knoxville for the Sultana, and there's one in Memphis as well.
So were they all killed?
No, about 1,500, almost 1,600 men were killed. But they also had passengers on board too. Men and women and children were on board too. And the river was at flood stage, and they were going upriver with a bad boiler and an overloaded ship. So the captain of the ship was tried for sinking the ship. Well, actually, it wasn't the captain. It was one of the officers that loaded the ship, that was in charge of getting those prisoners on, had some kind of a deal working with the captain, and they were getting some payback, I think. And so Speed was his name. And he was found not guilty, and they named the street after him.
I was going to say, that's Speed Street.
He became a very prominent citizen in Vicksburg and was actually elected judge. But he was a Union officer that loaded that ship.
Was anybody convicted?
No.
No.
Nobody was ever convicted of it. There's a special on Netflix, not on Netflix, but I saw it was either
MPB maybe?
No, it was Netflix or Amazon. I saw it. It was called the Sultana. Just Google it, and there's a whole. It's like a Ken Burns kind of a history of it. Very interesting accounting of the whole thing. And this is the Cairo that they found in the Yazoo River in 1960, and they pulled it out 100 years after it had been sunk. And they found all the stuff they found on it were preserved in the silt of the river. So there's shoes and belt buckles and utensils to eat with, and bottles and wine bottles and medicines.
It's an interesting exhibit. It really is.
The men that were on board the shipmates were all from other countries. If you look at where they were from, Norway, Germany, France, Ireland, England, Scotland, all these other countries. So they didn't even speak English. They came over because they were paid to join the Union Army and fight for the Union. So they solicited a lot of soldiers from Europe to come over, because it was the Great Potato Famine in Ireland too. So they were bringing a lot of people here to fight for the Union Army. And there's Captain Carroll. His house was the White House down the corner next to the Belle of the Benz. He was a captain on the riverboat, the Anchor Line boat, and a friend of John Klein's. And this is about Dr. Pemberton, who invented Coca-Cola. Sold his recipe for $200. The Coca-Cola syrup. And the medicines: fat, the enemy that is shortening your life; banished how with sanitized tapeworms; jar pack, friends for a fair form; easy to swallow; no diet, no baths, no exercise. So that's how you get skinny. You just eat a tapeworm. There's Grove's Tasteless Chilled Cotton. But Andrew Kilmer was the swamp root king. He made all kinds of medicines. He made Dr. Kilmer's ocean weed heart remedy, Indian cough cure, Indian medicine jug. But my favorite is Dr. Kilmer's female remedy, the great blood purifier and system regulator, the only herbal alternative and depurative ever discovered, specially adapted to female constitutions. Do you think there's any whiskey in that? A little bit.
Probably.
This is Hall's catarrh cure, which was the swollen membranes in the nose and throat, but catarrh is what that means. Hall's cough drop, but it was a liquid before it was a cough drop. And another catarrh remedy was Dr. Pierce's fountain nasal injector, or douche, which is like our neti pots. People swear by those. And these are all the Union troops that were here for 14 years. They occupied Vicksburg. This is standing in front of the courthouse. That guy looks like he's about to jump. But they occupied the city for 14 years, probably had families and raised their children here and married, and These are all the Union officers here. Of course, Sherman. This guy was Wesley Powell. John Wesley Powell had lost his arm in Shiloh. He led a charge and they blew his arm off. So he suffered with that the rest of his life. But he went on to become the director of the U.S. Geological Survey, and he surveyed the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon in a boat with his wife in the 1800s. So you imagine how you do that with one arm.
Wow.
Sherman. And these are all the Union and Confederate officers. Of course, Pemberton surrendered to Grant here, and they thought he was a coward for surrendering, but I don't think he had a choice. I mean, his men were dying of starvation. They were dying of disease. He had to surrender. The people, citizens were dying. So I think he did the right thing. But once he surrendered, he was really kind of a man without a country. And Johnston was supposed to relieve him, and he never made it here. He was involved in some battles associated with the Vicksburg campaign, but he never made it to Vicksburg. And he became good friends with Sherman after the war. Of course, these guys all knew one another. They had all served together at West Point and in the Mexican War, so they knew each other. Sherman and Johnston became friends, and he died of pneumonia he contracted from being a pallbearer at General Sherman's funeral. And this is the war on the Mississippi from Kentucky all the way south of New Orleans. You see how curvy the river is. The river with that hairpin turn at Vicksburg. And here's the Yazoo River flowing in further north. So when the river cut through, it cut through here. And the Yazoo River, they diverted into the old riverbed. But the river changes course all the time. And it leaves a bit of one state on the other side of the river all the way down the river. Mighty Mississippi. And this is Douglas, the camel. Douglas was a camel that was brought to Vicksburg by a Mississippi regiment. Camels were brought to the United States for farming and for the Mexican War. Davis brought them here because he was Secretary of Defense of the United States before the Civil War started, and he became President of the Confederacy. But he was Secretary of Defense, and he, in the 1830s, they brought camels to the United States for the Mexican War. Well, they didn't work out too well because they were so ornery, but Mississippi brought their camel here, and he was carrying the band instruments because, everybody went into war with their own band, and they had drums, and the drums would give the troops direction as to which way to go. So the drums were very key in battle because it told them whether to flank left, flank right, flank straight, whatever the drum beat was. And so they had Douglas carrying their band instruments, and he got shot by a Union sharpshooter. So the Confederates ate him. Well, so here's the Union gunboats lined up on the other side of what was DeSoto Point. So you can see the river today versus the river then. They were firing over 6,000 rounds of mortar shells into the city.
That's a great book.
And then hairpin turn. Here's the Union gunboats lined up. These are hospital ships at port to treat the wounded after the battle. And this is DeSoto Point, which you can see properties over here. Well, they ferried trains over there. They had some plantations over there. It floods over there all the time. I don't know how they had anything over there.
I always thought it would have been cool to have built, some houses on stilts over there.
Yeah.
But
the Morrises,
too hard to build them to get it over there. I know, yeah.
Now I guess
DeSoto Island, you know.
This is Bella the Benz.
Yeah.
This is about 1900. I don't know when the streets were paved here, but they look like they're pretty muddy. And this is Cotton Harvest. Here's the Bella the Benz again. This house was torn down, but it was a huge house, and now that's what's there.